again, folks. James Craig here, or as my children would have you believe, the world's okayest miniature painter. And I'm here with Mini Masterworks to do another video on weathering techniques. Last time I did a video, we did the platform for our water tower scenery piece and did techniques to create weathered wood finishes. Today, we're going to spend some time working on the same piece, but we're going to do rust techniques instead. I'm going to show you different ways to do chipped paint, to do rust effects. We've got quite a bit to add to this that would make it really quite visually interesting, and some techniques that hopefully you'll find really useful and not too difficult to work with. So as a quick recap, I'm building a scale water tower. This will go in here. And this is the platform that I've decided will go around the water tower so that it can be usable for sniper positions, miniatures, whatever, in games like Fallout or Last Days, or basically any kind of modern or real-world system. And I've got a particular love of all things post-apocalyptic, so that's kind of the position I'm coming from. I am not a professional painter. I'm just a hobbyist. But as a hobbyist, I've had some great opportunities and some great results, mostly thanks to the help of other people doing things like this, helping me to learn techniques along the way. And so it just seems to be a good idea through, in this particular case, Mini Masterworks, to be able to give back to the community. So this particular piece, where we've done the weathered wood effects, ooh, look at that. We're going to focus mostly around the outer rim. I've added a few details, some bolts, some plastic strip made of green stuff and styrene. And we've added hatches to the top and bottom. And one thing you can see here, where we're starting from today, this was a smooth plastic piece. I know a lot of people, especially gamers, like to produce terrain and such using things from around their house. This was part of a plastic CD case, and so this was not a good type of plastic to paint. Paint adhesion is a bit of a problem on a lot of industrial and home plastics. So in order to make this surface much easier to paint and work with, I did a couple of things that I think are worth passing on. First, I gave it a light sanding with a high grit sandpaper just to give it a little bit of tooth on the surface. Even so, a lot of paints don't like to adhere. So using a spray paint, either that's made to bond to plastics, or as I did, one that has, let's see if I've got it right here. There we go. A self-etching primer. There are certain primers that work well for plastics and metals and other things. If you choose one that allows it to bite into the surface a little bit more, a primer that has its own properties that help it to adhere even better, that's a really useful thing. So I used that Duplicolor Automotive primer. It worked quite well. But then I also still went back into it again, and anywhere that I felt that the primer still wasn't adhering really, really well, I went back and resanded those parts a little bit to give them a little bit more tooth. And then I used a technique that I came up with somewhere along the way several years ago, and it's one that I quite like. I actually put super glue on the surface. Now, super glue will stick to just about anything. And I'm sure many of you out there have had models where super glue accidents have resulted in, weird ripples and spots that you didn't intend on models. And that can be a real pain in the butt sometimes. But what you can do is you can take a piece of blister foam and a bit of super glue, and squeezing some cheap super glue on here, I then stippled it with the sponge, which just went in the garbage after. It wrecks the sponge, but and in doing so, I was able to get some really cool, let's see if you can see some of those there a little bit, some really cool rough textures And those were stippled into place with the super glue. And then once that dries, I sprayed back in with Badger's Stynylrez Res Black, my favorite primer. And yeah, that had no trouble sticking to the super glue and plastic surface. And now what we've got here is something that you might initially think, oh, well, why would you want a goopy, blobby surface? Well, quite frankly, we're creating a great surface to show bubbling rust, corrosion coming from underneath. To all my friends who play Gaslands out there, it's a really cool and actually fairly easy to control way to add small, really textured rust to your cars as they rot out. But it can be used in all kinds of different post-apocalyptic settings or just modern settings where things are really corroded. So the blistering under the paint is quite intentional, and it helped us both to deal with adhesion issues on industrial type plastics, and also to give us a great paint effect that's gonna help us along the way, adding actual texture to go with our implied rust effects. This is a kind of technique that a lot of people also use. My hatch and stuff here, instead of using the super glue on it, I used Tamiya extra thin cement, which is a glue that melts plastic. And a lot of historical modelers use that to purposefully lightly melt the surface of, say, the top part of a tank or a metal hatch, and then to stipple small textures into it to make it look more natural and less smooth. So I did the same thing on the little styrene door and stuff that I attached here as well. So we've got some great textures already started before we even begin the paints and other tricks. So we'll see where this takes us, and I'm going to be working with a variety of paints and a variety of techniques today. We're going to use some chipping techniques. I'll show you a few different things, and we'll see how this starts to come together. So I'm just going to reposition the camera so you can see my work surface more easily, and I'll be right back. Alrighty, so here I am at my trusty airbrush station. I have my fume hood, I've got my mask, got my airbrush. For those of you who are going to ask, as inevitably happens with these things, this one's a Patriot Extreme by Badger. It's kind of a general workhorse airbrush. It's got a really cool feature. This dial at the front here lets you make your airbrush do things that normally you probably wouldn't want your airbrush to do, which is to spit paint and to create weird little droplets instead of a nice even spray. But when you're creating rust, that's actually a really handy thing to be able to do. So we're going to be playing around with that setting a little bit today. But anything that I'm about to show you here could easily be done with just a paintbrush and some stippling. But I like using my airbrush. It makes some of this stuff go pretty quickly. So I'll be spraying a variety of colors here onto our rusting surfaces. Now, the colors that I'm choosing are nothing really specific. Much like the weathered wood, it has more to do with creating a sense of feel and atmosphere rather than choosing some kind of particular accurate system. So I've got paints here by Minotaur, by Vallejo, by P3. This one here, this is Camo Black Brown. This is one of my all-time favorite colors in any range. Vallejo Model Air. I've just got a variety of... There goes my compressor. I have a variety of browns and oranges. This one's Ammo of MiG. The idea is I'm going to spray a few of these on, and I'll show you at different steps what this overall is looking like. But I'm going to pause while I do the spraying so that you don't have to listen to my airbrush, my fume hood just blast through your speakers. So I'll be back in just a second with the first couple colors on. All right, so we've done a little bit of spraying. And we have here some results as they dry. So far I've gone in and I've sprayed just a couple of colors of brown to create a really, let's see what we can pick up here, a really mottled surface. Nothing accurate, nothing precise. I also masked off our wood on the other side using a bit of handy Tamiya tape and some paper. and to help protect all that wood that we spent all that time working on. I've added in a dark brown. It was the camo black brown, and I've added in a bit of a black red, which is the color of oxide primers and also certain types of rust. I have a great file. I've got pictures on my computer. I've got physical pictures. I look around at rust all the time, and my wife always makes fun of me for taking pictures of it wherever I go. But you know what? When you're trying to create a rusty surface or trying to create a look or trying to decide what you want it to look like, or most importantly, trying to pick out colors to represent your rust, you can't go better than actually, some observed work. So I'm pretty happy with where this is going. It's time to add some fresher rust now, which fresher rust is usually going to be brighter towards orange, and also it'll give us kind of a more dynamic finish in the end. So I'm going to throw my mask back on, throw the compressor back on, and we're going to add a couple more tones to this and see how this develops. I've turned off the compressor and the fume hood for a moment just so you guys can see me do this. So one thing I like to do in order to create some really random spray patterns is to spray from quite a distance back. Allow it to atomize in a wide spray pattern, and even if it dries a little bit before it hits the surface, it's only going to add to your textures with your rust. So I have the air going, and I just pull back, pull back, pull back. Doing this lets you get some fine variety and spatters across the surface. I'm going to change my direction by changing the angles of the plate. I'm going to pick a few areas where I think you would have more corrosion and more new rust, like around all the bolt heads and some of the edges where water would continue to collect. I'm going to just do some light splatters across other areas too. All right, right now I'm using Vallejo Orange Rust. It's a Vallejo air color ready to use in the bottle. Handy dandy. And I am just going to randomly lay some of that in. All right, I'm going to have to turn my compressor back on. I'm running out of air, so I'll do a little bit more spraying on this, and I'll be back in just a second to show you where that leads us. So let's see what we can see now. You can see that I have sprayed various oranges throughout here, and also, there we go, that's better. I have dialed tight that section on the end of my airbrush to get these great little spatters around that I find fairly interesting when working in layers and layers of rust and finish. Now, if you don't have an airbrush that will do that, you can always just put paint on the end of a paintbrush, like a stiff paintbrush or an old toothbrush, and literally just flick that paint onto it. It's certainly something that is doable without an airbrush, as are all these techniques. All of this could just as easily have been stippled on. I just like the airbrush. All right, so now that we've got put in those deep tones, put in those red tones, put in those yellow tones, I'm going to go back in one more time, kind of a medium brown tone that will help kind of tie it all together. So we've got variety, but we also have kind of a cohesive main dark rust color. So we'll hit that up. Next, I think what I'll use is probably one of the P3 browns. I've got some, let's see, what's this? This is Blood Tracker Brown. So we'll use some Blood Tracker Brown today and hit our next steps with it. All right. So now we've got a great variety of actual surfaces and some interesting variety in the rust that plays across them. Now, a lot of this work is actually going to end up being covered by the coats of paint that we put on top. But what's going to happen is when we reveal some of the rust, we don't want it to look like it's a cohesive, continuous coat underneath. We want it to look like it's got a natural amount of decay and variety. So this is, I think, going to work quite nicely for us. I think we've got a lot going on. I think it's going to be pretty interesting. Look at those textures in there made by the super glue. Oops, wrong way. There we go. Made by the super glue, along with the variety of paints that have been stippled and sprayed on. Forgot to turn off my compressor again. So yeah, I think we can get some pretty cool things happening here with this base now. So for the next steps, I'm going to use a couple of different products. Now, something you need to remember with painting, right? When I chose these colors, I just grabbed a few brown colors that I liked off my shelf. Very, very few techniques in this hobby are reliant on one specific brand, one specific color, one specific thing, all right? Everybody has their preferences. Everybody has their different, sponsors or whoever they're working with. My collection is pretty broad. There are some products that I have a particular preference to. Some people, when they're doing chipping as a weathering technique, which is something that we're going to be doing here today, they will use hairspray, the hairspray chipping method. And what started out with hairspray has evolved somewhat. There are other products now. Let me see what I got here. Oh, there it is. This is one of my favorites. It's by a company called Ammo Mig. Ammo makes a chipping fluid, which is a lot like distilled hairspray. To be perfectly honest, it's very similar in how it works. The theory behind this is that you spray on a water-soluble but drying coat and then paint over it. The acrylic paints that we use to do miniatures with are actually semi-permeable barriers. They do allow a certain degree of moisture to seep through them. So if you paint something with a dissolvable coat and then a coat of paint, once you add water to the paint, it will for a time dissolve the coat that's underneath and allow you to break that paint off the surface. It can be a pretty effective way to work, and it can be a lot of fun. It's a technique that I particularly like. The thing with hairsprays is that different brands are going to give you different consistencies, and most of them will work well. Some of them I hear work better than others, but by going to an actual chipping product, I prefer to take the guesswork out of it and know every time what I'm going to get, and know that it won't yellow over time, and know that we've got a safe, stable product to work with. So that's why I choose that. But you're going to find all kinds of other ones out there. There are other brands of chipping fluid. There are also other people who swear the hairspray is even better. So whatever works for you, you're looking for a dissolvable barrier that will sit underneath your top coat of paint. So I'm going to spray some of that on here right now. I'm just going to use the same airbrush. I gave it a quick clean out. And this is a really thick, viscous liquid. You're supposed to shake it until you see bubbles in the container. So we'll just shake the heck out of that for a second and see the bubbles in there. There we go, bubbles. So that you know that it's well mixed. It's well mixed enough that my lid is stuck and I'm going to need two hands to open this. All right, so I'm going to open up some of this scratching and chipping fluid. I'm just going to grab myself a pipette. So I don't have to just pour this from the jar. And I'll just throw some of that in there. Good stuff. Set my pipette to the side to be rinsed out. As it is water soluble, I don't have to worry too much about it clogging up and wrecking anything. We will just set this aside. Excellent. And so now I've got an airbrush full of this clear fluid. Now I'm going to turn us back over to the airbrush booth, and I'm going to trust that my compressor is charged enough that I don't have to subject you to listening to it for a moment. And we will move the water bottle out of the way. We will spray a wet looking, fairly heavy coat of this right onto our surface. Now, if there are any areas that you don't want the rust to come through, or anything that you painted the rust colors that you're not really happy with, then just don't spray this stuff there. This can also be applied with a paintbrush, but it's more difficult. It's better with an airbrush. So if you don't have an airbrush, that's another reason the hairspray might be the right choice for you. So I'm just going to put a fairly hefty coat of this stuff on. And we're going to let that dry up for a little bit. Nice and wet. Let me show you the, okay, very wet coat. We're going to let that dry up for a little bit before we can spray our next coat on top. That'll give me enough time to clean out this airbrush and to prepare a few of our next steps. So back with you guys in a few minutes, and we'll see how this goes next. All right, so a little work with the hairdryer to help speed things along, but not too much because we don't want to weaken any of our layers. So now we've got a mostly dry surface that has great variation, and that definitely has very rusty qualities and has some really interesting surface textures that we created with the glue. So now it's time to add our main color to it. Now, I was looking at all kinds of pictures of great rusty water towers. I'm not the only one who loves this stuff. It's all over the internet, folks. And again, I forgot to turn off my compressor for you. One of these days I'll learn. So I am going to, I've chosen to do mine in blue and white. The white is going to be really dramatic for the top part, and that way any graffiti and stuff that I put on it should pop off in interesting ways. And just some of my favorite water towers that I saw were white and really rusted. And I decided on the blue because for Christmas this year I got an MDF scenery kit that looks like the entrance to a Fallout vault. So I might make some Vault Tech references. And I thought the blue would also really pop nicely with all of these warm orangish brown tones. So I'm gonna do this platform in blue. I'll do the main water tower in white, and then I'll decide whether I want to do the roof of the water tower in white or blue. I haven't quite finished that part yet, but we'll get there. But for today, I'm going to do a top coat in blue. Now, the blue I'm going to use right now is by a new paint brand called Legendary Paints. And this actually comes from a company just up the road from where I live. Simon is the guy behind this. He's been a friend of mine since we drove to Gen Con several years ago together. Really great guy. So big shout out to Simon. These Legendary Paints are phenomenal. A lot of them have that same kind of really matte finish that people like in scale color paints, but these ones are made domestically and are something that's just coming to market, but they're really, really cool. So, you know, I don't work for Simon. I have a few of these. I like them, so I'm just sharing what I like. So we're going to give this a try, and I might do a little bit of highlighting on top of it with Signar Blue Highlight from P3. We'll see. We'll see how it looks once it gets on there. So I'm going to turn back on. I'm going to put on my mask, turn back on my sprayers, and do a proper job with this. But in just a couple minutes, this rusted platform we spent all this time working on will be blue instead. Let's see how that goes. So here we are again. I decided not to use the P3 blue. The Legendary blue just sprayed on so smooth and so easily, and is definitely a strong, you know, Vault Tech kind of blue. So that made me really happy. That was super easy. One fun thing when I was cleaning the airbrush is I got a little drip of water on there, and you can see, yeah, I got blue all over my hands too, that it already started to eat away at that surface underneath, at that barrier, which means that this is going to work really well. This is going to be fantastically fun. Now, I've gathered a number of tools here that are some of my favorite things to use when I'm doing chipping. One, I've got this brush that I picked up at the dollar store. I think it's supposed to be for cleaning grout, but it's just got great stiff bristles. I have an old Wolverine toothbrush. Shout out to my friends who make Marvel Crisis Protocol. I have your toothbrush. This is just another great stiff bristle brush, and if I put batteries in it, it does these like swirly actions, which can make for some interesting effects, but I don't need the batteries today for what I'm doing. I have just some old cheap brushes that have been poorly treated. You can see that this one had all kinds of glue or something on the end. It was a pretty stiff plastic brush from the dollar store to begin with. I have a larger artist brush that also has kind of a stiff end to it, which makes it great. This is a ball burnisher. If you look at the end of it, it's got a little ball in there. I use these for sculpting, but if we're looking to scratch some straight lines, but we don't want to actually score into the paint like we would with an actual sharp tip like a knife, this is a really handy thing. And the last thing I've got here is this, which is a little, it's called an Interdental Brush, and effectively it's for flossing your teeth. But it's got all these little hairs on it and kind of a wire center, so it can make some really interesting little scrapes and scratches as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a big kind of soft brush. This one looks good. All right, just a soft old brush and a little bit of water. And I am going to humidify the surface here. So you don't have to it doesn't have to be a major soaking. But look at this. If we look, let me see if I can do this up close for you. You can see that even just using this soft brush right now and a little bit of water, that paint is peeling right away. All right. Now I want to try and control this a little bit. So I'm going to bring this down here where I can see better. And maybe what I'll do is I'll reposition the camera so you can better see what I'm doing as well. So I'm just going to use this stiff plasticky brush and gently stipple away at that surface. If you look, we're getting all kinds of great rust coming through. I am going to put a scratch in here, although to be perfectly honest, in the bottom of a water tower, I'm not sure why there would be a scratch there, but this is as much for showing you how things are done, or more so than for the technique, or than for the scenery piece. So I'm just going to draw kind of a scratch. I just did that across there with the back end of the brush. Could be done even more effectively with this ball burnisher tool we were talking about. Look at that. And as I just gently brush across that with the water, you'll see that that scratch really starts to open up and gives us some really beautiful look. So if you were doing something like along the edge of a dumpster or a car or a Rhino APC, you know, using little scratches and then just kind of opening them up with the water can be really, really cool. Different tools will give you, of course, different effects, and you can choose to do as much or as little as you want. But seeing this should hopefully give you a bit of an understanding as to why we took the time initially to not just paint it, you know, one rust color of brown, but rather to get a variation of rusts traveling across the surface of this entire piece, because as you unveil them, you should be able to see that kind of variety there. It will make your whole piece look not only more realistic, but a lot more interesting. All right, so there are some starting rust and scratches. I'm going to do a little bit more here. Let's get some more water out here. Let's see what else we can do. I'm going to use the big brush now. And something else to think about. Some people get worried. Am I doing too much? Well, in all likelihood, the answer is probably yes. Most things don't rust like absolutely crazily. If we're doing post-apocalyptic, then absolutely not. There's plenty of rust to be had in the centuries to come as mankind stops repainting things and so forth and so on. I really like these little scratch marks, so I'm just going to put a few more on there. But something to remember if I feel that I've opened up an area too much, if I feel like I'm not as pleased with something, I still have this blue paint, right? And quite frankly, in my process, I am usually aiming to open up some random rust in space, and then I want to go back in and refine it so it looks even better. But you have the opportunity to create all the random effects, or as much as you want controlled effects, throughout your chipping process. Now I'm going to go back up here a little bit because there were some spots I really liked the textures that were on the edge here. And so I'm going to make sure that where that rust was really bubbled up with the glue, we want to make sure that that is clearly an area that gets kind of rusted and eaten away. Because if it's bubbling up through the paint, and if the back of my car is any indication, there will be rust forming around those areas where you see the bubbles. And I've got these great little bolts that I added on here, and they're the kind of thing too. The more edges you have, the more space water and salt and acid rain and all that kind of good stuff can collect. So the more likely you are to end up with significant rusting in those spots. So I'm going to also work just below those. Actually, you know what? I'll work mostly on the top. I think I'll add another technique to the below after. All right, but we get this great random surface chipping across. And if we want to really kind of work in an area and open it up a lot, we can grab a bigger brush and work away to our heart's content. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to continue this chipping process with the water and these random tools I have here. Love that one. So I'm going to do some more of this across all the surfaces here, and we're going to let it dry up a little, and we'll see where that gets us. All right, so I'll be back for you guys in a couple of seconds, for me a little later, and we will continue this. So a couple of minutes of work later, and we have some pretty great corrosion. There we go. Some really great kind of natural looking chipping, fading of paint, and a wide variety of rust tones underneath. Looks great on these edges. Let's see if I can get that in focus there. If I turn it this way, there we go. I'll play with the camera to get a handle on this, but that is some pretty cool looking rusty platform action. All right, so where do we go from here? Well, for some people you could say, oh, that's great, I'm done. But as we know, great work is never really done. So I'm gonna go a little further with this yet. We're gonna use a couple of other products. I'm not gonna belabor which ones in particular. The bottom line is we're gonna use a little bit of weathering powder and some enamels that I love to use in my weathering process. Oh, there's my palette. I mentioned this in the previous video. It's a comic bag and board. So it's a white palette that's disposable after, so it's great for when you're doing messy things. So I think the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to start shaking up a couple of enamel products that I like to use. These ones all happen to be from Ammo of MIG today, but I use quite a number of enamels and different weathering powders. Now what I've got here is I've got some rust color in pay attention to the camera, James, you'll do much better. I have a couple of different rust colored enamel washes, and we've got a little bit of some streaking grime, and I've also got some pigments here. I'm just trying to choose which ones to use. Oh, this is one of my favorite ones right here. I'll grab that. We'll give these all a good shaking up before we get to working with them. Now, you don't have to use enamel washes to do this kind of work. I just happen to like them and have a bunch of them. This is contrast paint, Sigor Brown. You can do some of these kinds of effects with this. I just find that using the enamels gives me a few more options and a few neat little tricks to work with. Other people like to use things like inks. But again, today we're going to stick with enamels and powders. Let's see. There's my favorite one. Okay, oh, that's the pigment version. Track Rust is my favorite one because it's got this weird little bit of grittiness to it that is just really cool. Probably should have pulled these out before I started talking. There we go, Trax Wash. And we'll make Trax Wash. So, again, I'm going to use some synthetic brushes with this. This is used with paint thinner. These are enamels. They are not particularly friendly to your brushes. You do not want to be using your Broken Toads, your Winsor Newtons, or whatever with these. You just want to use some plastic crap brushes, to be perfectly honest. Right, so I've got a bit of paint thinner here, and I will put that in this little dish. You don't need much of it. There we go. So just some odorless mineral spirits, nothing fancy. And I am going to open up a couple of these different rust enamels so we can get a bit of natural variety in all of our finishes. I love these things. Okay, line them up and line their lids up so I know which one's which for the lid as well. There we go. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of this Rust Streaks one here. Give it a bit of a stir. Even though I shook them, these things really need a good agitation. They've been kind of sitting for a while. Need to get one of those fancy little vortex mixers. We'll see about that. All right. So I'm just going to apply some of this, and it's somewhere between like there are parts of it that are almost like mud and parts of it that are like water, and if you mix it together fully, it's still very much a different tactile feel than the regular acrylic paints. So it's kind of neat stuff. So sometimes I want to use some of that thicker, muddier sludge, and sometimes I really just want the liquid part. But what I'm doing right now is I'm adding it into a couple of my rust zones to make them more interesting, more active, and to allow me to create drips and runs in the rust. This will also help to enliven the tones that I have there. Ooh, look at that. That's nice and chunky. I'm going to put that over here where my rust is supposed to be chunky. Oh, beautiful extra textures happening. I'm going to stick some of that down here too. The secret to most painting effects, and especially with weathering effects, is to layer your effects. Don't just do one thing and then leave it. Refine it, refine it, refine it, add to it. So add mud and dirt on top of everything else, and you will end up with much more interesting variations and effects. Now, here's a spot where, look right there, I've got the bolt on the one side. On the other side, I just left the hole as if the bolt was supposed to be there. So this is going to be one of our spots where we're going to make it specifically look like it's streaking. So I'm going to really just jam some of that in there. A little bit more of this one too. Maybe just a touch of this. There we go. And so now I've effectively covered that hole and brought pigment down from that hole. Okay. Here's where it gets fun. Now, people often want to paint rust streaks on things. I see it on 40K stuff all the time. I think it's a really great look, or it can be. But it can also look really clunky, and some people do it just so well. So I'm going to show you a trick to make it better than average. Little tip from the world's okayest miniature painter. All right, so I'm just going to get some clean thinner on a clean brush. And what I want to do now is I'm going to refine my drips. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the clean thinner down one side of the drip. And then I'm going to wipe my brush off. And then, let's see if I can do this upside down and backwards. I'll paint clean thinner down the other side of the drip. See, what that does is it actually removes some of the enamel. And it makes it so, let's actually look at what I'm doing. So the edges of that drip that you had originally created become a little bit diffuse across the surface. So it becomes a stain that kind of spreads a little bit. But also, after having painted on that line really thick, we don't actually necessarily want the whole drip to be like really huge and thick. We want to bring it back down to scale a little bit and make it look more natural. So what we're doing is, if this is the original drip, we are brushing away both sides. And so what's left behind is a thinner, more natural looking drip that also kind of plays a little bit across the surface of your piece. It's a pretty cool look and a neat way to work. I'm also going to go through in some of the other places I added some of the enamels. I'm just going to kind of stipple on a little thinner around the edges of them to again just kind of give it that more kind of diffused edge. This lets us get all kinds of new added layers of texture and color into our rust. We could also be adding powdered pigments to this too, and we'll add some of those in a minute, because again, I like to layer, but I've got this one great kind of partially dried out. I lift the bottle upside down so that the sediment would collect near the top and the lid on purpose, so that I could get some more of this kind of really textural rust stuff. But then I'll go back again with my clean brush, my clean thinner. We're just going to let those bleed their way back down into the surface, so they diffuse across the surface a little bit and give us a very natural look. I'm going to take some of this as well and just let the capillary action pull it around these bolt heads to make sure that they are well defined and interesting looking, and then go back with the clean thinner and just let it run. So we end up with, what's that spot? I'm going to drag that down, and I am going to clean brush one side, two sides, just leaving it in the middle so it'll look great when it dries. All right, so now I've got some much more interesting variety in my rusts going all the way around. These bolt heads are starting to look pretty cool. I want them to be kind of extra grimy, so I'm just going to put a little bit more in around a couple of them. This part can't be that much fun to watch. So So once I get a couple of these in, then I'll show you something new that'll be fun. I'll come back in a couple minutes. It's going to take me just a little bit long. Okay, so now we can see we've got great varieties in our texture and colors of our rust. Looks like it's coming right on through. I haven't even done any highlighting around the chips or anything like that. But what we've ended up with is a pretty cool rust effect. So, just a few more steps left to finish up this section of the platform. The next thing I would probably do is using these same rust pigments, these rust enamels. I would probably go and hit the heads of some of these nails very gently, very carefully, so we don't paint giant blobs across our carefully created woodwork. But giving a few of them a little rust stain around them will give us just a little bit more interest again. And it's all about building techniques on top of techniques to create a comprehensive finish. Aside from adding some rust around some of our nail heads, often the wood around those would darken up a little bit more too, so we might go back and add a little more darkness around a couple of them. But I think we're in pretty good shape overall. I'm just going to get a little more on that one. So aside from adding a little rust to some of our nail heads and bringing that kind of tone into the wooden platform, I would like to add a little bit of a greenish tone or a little bit of algae, a little bit of moss, something like that. Just I find that adding a little bit of green to your wood will also kind of push home the aging and the lack of care. There's all kinds of, where I live, there's a lot of farms, there's a lot of barns around. A lot of them are very old, and so there's lots of great examples of barn board and the kinds of colors and stuff that you can get in aging wood. And so I think I'm going to add just a tiny bit of green to mine. Now, there are enamel products. MIG makes slimy green light and slimy green dark. Both of these work very, very well. You could also use a green ink, or you could use a green powdered pigment. I think there's the faded green powdered pigment right there. Maybe I'll use that in our nice dry boards. Okay, this is a green, very light green dry pigment. Let's see what it looks like on here. I think this should work pretty nicely. I'm just going to give myself just a few areas, a little bit of a natural greenish tone, subtle, but very effective. Yeah, right in the middle of that. I like that there. This is kind of like the Bob Ross part, you know? You just kind of go for it and enjoy the happy little accidents and whatnot. But I'll hold that up so you can see. Let's get that in focus. Right up here, hard to keep in focus, sorry folks. A little bit of green in that wood goes a long way towards aging it. And you get some really beautiful overall effects. Got a little bit of rust in some of those boards now. And so I'm just going to add a few more green spots. We've got some great things happening here. And I've got another video yet to shoot for you guys in which we'll be doing different rusting techniques on the top portion of the water tower. We'll use some of the same techniques. We will add more additional techniques to it so that we can find out lots of different ways to create rust. I'll be doing rust, and then maybe somewhere down the road, if you guys enjoy these and if this all all works out, then maybe I can do one on graffiti and some special techniques around that. So have yourselves a good one, folks. This is James Craig with Mini Masterworks, and let's get out there and let's get painting. Let's have some fun. See you.